Hi. Today we're gonna hear a presentation about how to research LARP by Jukka Skärkijärvi. He is editing a couple books about gaming. He do master studies about gaming. He played LARPs about 10 years and do event about 13 years. 40 years. Okay. So 14 years. Okay, so bravo.
Thank you, and good morning, everyone. As stated, I'm in game studies at the Tampere University at the Center of Excellence for Game Culture Studies. My background is in English literature, so I've had to do a great deal of learning because a lot of the time, LARP scholarship is about people, and I'm used to texts. I'm here to talk about the challenges and methods of academic LARP research. There's a lot of overlap with tabletop role-playing research, so that'll also come up occasionally. Also because these fields are tiny enough that it's still entirely possible for one person to have read everything. I apologize if some of the stuff I say feels obvious. This is my first portal. I have no idea what to expect of the audience. It's safer to go with the basics. And a word about LARP studies to start with. This is what we'd call an interdisciplinary field. A field in that, as opposed to a discipline with its own specific theoretical frameworks and methods, it's defined by what we are looking at. And it's deeply interdisciplinary in that people have been showing up since day one from their home disciplines to study LARP using what they've learned wherever they got their degrees. There's a lot of sociologists running around, some psychologists, the occasional business scholar. The edu-LARP crowd is, less surprisingly, teeming with pedagogues. And then there's communication scientists, theater scholars, religious studies scholars, the occasional computer scientists, museologists. Like I'm currently working with the Finnish Museum of Games on a LARP exhibition. And how does one even do that? How do you put a LARP in a museum? And there's a few of us literature scholars. And considering how incredibly niche the field is, the variety is huge. One friend of mine is actually a specialist in German cinema. Engineers and physical sciences people we get less of, and I don't think I've ever seen an ethnomusicologist paper about LARP. Anyway, half an hour would not be enough to look at all of those, and frankly, I lack the expertise to do that presentation. So this is about the target. What in it is hard to study, and how is it approached? This is a glimpse at what it is that we do, and on what you can expect if you embark on this field. And also I have 30 minutes, including time for questions, so stuff will be left out. There's a few issues to settle, though, before one gets into the actual researching. For many reasons, LARP is actually kind of hard to pin down. LARP is a remarkably fragmented assemblage of practices that spread very widely across the globe. And there's reasons for this. Like when it comes to tabletop role-playing games, we can point at Dungeons and Dragons and say that for our purposes, it was the first modern role-playing game. And that's actually more complicated, but that's a different talk. Ask me at the bar. But with LARP, we can't do that. Not really. What we understand as LARP arose in a bunch of different places at very different times from different routes, somewhat independently of one another. Like my understanding is that in many parts of Eastern Europe, this kind of business goes back up to a century or so and has its roots in education. In other places, it's been D&D players standing up from the table and heading into the woods, or murder mystery dinners, or it's been more informed by theater than tabletop role-playing games. And most of these people, at least in the 70s and 80s, they were very young and documented their stuff very poorly. So, for instance, in Finland, we don't really know when LARP began. And because of this, we all bring in a crap load of assumptions based on what we learned in our own cultures. And if we are to look at LARP from outside of our own cultural sphere, or articulate research within that sphere of the people outside of it, we must be able to identify and question those assumptions. Like there's a story from the early days of the Kultury conference in the Nordics that after the annual event started and brought together LARPers from Norway, Finland, Sweden, and Denmark, it took them 3 years to figure out that when they were talking about characters, none of them meant the same thing. The longest I've had totaled 54-page character and group briefs. It later dawned on me once I ventured abroad that this is not the norm. And then there's a few handy concepts that we've been talking about for ages that I find convenient for pinning down some of the questions about LARP. The first one is the first-person audience. It's actually a more complicated theoretical framework originating from Christopher Sandberg. But for our purposes, here the key thing is inner play, developed further by Markus Montala and Jussi Holopainen. The player is the creator and only audience for their character's inner life. Their motivations, decision-making, reasoning, regrets, everything they thought but didn't say aloud. Even if you could have a full record of everything that was said and done in a LARP, and this has been done, the inner play cannot be captured. And the second thing is that LARP is ephemeral. Once the game is done, it's gone. The play situation, the interactions, the emotions, and everything they rose from are in the original form lost, except for what maybe was or was not captured in runtime recordings. Even if a LARP is rerun, it's not the same game. People will not recreate the same emergent storylines. They will not say the same things. Yeah, ethics. And this is something that was kind of new to me, coming from literature. Like, it's not that it's somehow an unethical discipline, but is that there's a limited amount of harm you can cause when deconstructing the gender relations to me was true, or ask Pride and Prejudice for content before publishing or analysis. A lot of LARP research, on the other hand, involves other people. And a lot of the time, one wants to involve those other people when they've been having deeply emotional experiences, moments of vulnerability, and other really personal stuff. Their characters may have gotten up to all kinds of terrible things. Like the designers, they can restage the Stanford prison experiment, which they did, by the way. But we as researchers cannot. At least on paper, and ensuring the ethics is actually pretty simple. Anyone you're researching should have full knowledge of that you're conducting research, what that research is for, and what their interview answers or whatever will be used for. They need to consent to their whatever being used for research, and be able to withdraw that consent along with the material from the study at any time. If for some reason you're doing a blind study, obviously they cannot know everything, but they need to know what they can't know, as it were. And if there's potential for the research to be somehow harmful to the participants, they need to be very clearly informed, and so does your ethics board. That's why there's so little research on drinking games. Also, the research subjects should be anonymous and unrecognizable from the published research. No real names, only as much personal information as is absolutely necessary. The one exception is the expert interview. If you're researching a LARP and interview the designer about it, for instance, anonymity can be somewhat pointless. If there aren't too many people involved, and especially if the subject is sensitive, and especially if there's direct quoting, it's also a good idea to give the subjects an opportunity to comment on the draft version before publication. And this additionally also needs to be documented in whatever you end up publishing. There was a minor uproar last week about a marketing studies paper. It was the one covered by The Guardian, if you saw that, that talked about filming at a LARP using a GoPro camera hidden inside a hat. And it did not say that they had the consent of the film, of those people they filmed, which, based on a Facebook conversation, they actually did, but that was not mentioned in the paper. It looked incredibly scary. And I'm mentioning this bit here also because that paper, which presented Bleed as just something LARPers talk about and just straight up ignored 15 years of research on it. I mean, there's already a body of research on a lot of topics about in LARP. Before embarking on a quest to reinvent the wheel, one should be familiar with what's out there. It's not only about respecting those who came before and being polite, it usually also results in better research. And since the stuff can be very spread out, it's useful to be able to ask the research community, for which I've included a couple of links at the end. This is also very relevant because a good way of finding out about people's LARP experiences and interplay is asking them. I mean, I feel these are somewhat self-explanatory. They're also fairly common. The in-depth interview. You have a person and a set of questions you want to find out about. You ask the questions. You ask follow-ups and clarifying questions until you feel you have what you want, or the interviewee gets fed up and wanders off. Rinse and repeat until you figure you have enough interviews. This theoretically allows you to build a rapport with the interviewee, which is good especially when it comes to sensitive topics. Of course, it also requires you to be good with people. Though I find that LARP self-selects for that more than, say, literature studies. And there's the questionnaire. You've seen these online. You've maybe even answered one of these. The researcher formulates a questionnaire about what they want to know. This is actually really hideously difficult, since you don't want the questions to contain bias and direct answers a certain way. You have to get them right the first time because you can't ask clarifying follow-ups. And you have to make it interesting or short enough that people who aren't really into answering questionnaires don't get fed up and wander off. Then you spam it on Facebook and on forums and hope that enough people take the bait so you get a credible sample size, but also hope it doesn't go viral and give you more than you want to work with. You can build this for quantitative or qualitative research. The first one is when you want a lot of numbers that can go crunch. And the second one is for open-ended questions, like an interview with no follow-up. Having a lot of open-ended questions can be hazardous because people can get fed up and wander off. But on the other hand, LARPers tend to be passionate about their hobby and want to explain it and tell you about their character. And then we have the focus group, which is actually something we use it's used in game studies. I don't think I've seen it used in LARP research yet. Please tell me if you have. But it probably would yield interesting results. It's an in-depth group discussions focusing on a topic of interest or relevance. You get to hear what people think about things, but also how they arrive at that. The researcher needs to moderate the group, but ideally can mostly just observe. Like in video game studies, this has been used so that the group convenes before and after playing a game. I feel that in LARP there is an obvious application for that. And I know that someone is right now thinking that this could double as a debrief. I would say that depends on the LARP, but it makes my spider sense tingle. And then we get into ethnography. Like, you can't really understand LARP just by asking or reading about it, right? You have to do it. And ethnography and role-playing go back a long way. The start of role-playing game studies is generally considered to be Gary Allen Fine's shared fantasy from 1983, where he documents his ethnographic research into role-playing games groups from the American northern Midwest. It's actually very much worth reading. Look it up. In ethnography, a method devised in the field of anthropology, the researcher embeds themselves into the culture researched and participates in its life. It is time-consuming, but often the only way to really get to understand nuance, unwritten rules, and how stuff actually works instead of how you're told that it works. And in this instance, the ethical framework is also a bit different, since you can't be informing everyone you meet that you are doing research. And also, as Fine has noted, you have to be nicer and friendlier than your normal personality might be, which is, in a way, deceptive. You're like pervasively LARPing the kindly ethnographer. And then there's auto-ethnography, which really embraces subjectivity. You go into the culture and make self-reflective observations of yourself operating within that culture. And there's an American scholar, Jonea Kemper, who has been doing some beautiful work on this with this method. I understand she's working on a book, but that's not out yet. But for now, there's a couple of articles on Nordic.org about it. And that's where I ran out of printouts. Yes. And here's the thing that I've been actually trained to do, and which doesn't really seem to get done a lot. I'm using textual analysis here as an umbrella term for the whole toolkit of literary criticism, all the angles of approach we can use for teasing out meanings from a text. Like discourse analysis, feminist criticism, eco-criticism, post-colonial criticism, what have you. And now a lot of these are discourses that are very much do exist in the field of LARP, in the conversation we have online or last night at the bar. But it doesn't really exist yet on the academic side. The elusive nature of LARP. We have to pin down the specific text that we're analyzing. And by the way, everything can be treated as a text, or rather the word text is what this corner of academia uses as shorthand for this thing that we are studying. It can be the textual materials of LARP, but we know that's just the springboard to run to the actual LARP. It can be a specific run, but of course that's not something you can generalize from. And also it needs to be done in an ethical fashion, since writing a critical paper about something that a bunch of people did as a hobby has a high probability of pissing someone off, and then you don't get to come to the next LARP. There's I feel, a kind of a critical idiom of LARP that we are still missing. And since it seems that at least some parts of the field are headed to commercialization and developing LARP into a product, that's something we will eventually have an actual serious need for. LARP studies, like any human endeavor to knowledge, is not yet finished. And here's the one slide that's probably actually useful to you. Feel free to take photos. I'll see if the whole deck can probably be put up somewhere. The Facebook groups are where LARP and role-playing researchers hang out. The books are a good start. They're good starting points, plus Shared Fantasy, which is, I think is just a really great read. And a lot of his stuff is freely available. NordicLARP.org has a wiki where you can find links to PDFs of nearly all the books from the Nordic LARP scene. And they are what we call a para-academic, in that they're published outside of the academic system and they're not peer-reviewed. But they do get referenced in academia, and that's where a lot of our concepts for discussing LARP come from. There's also the American WeirdCon companion books, which do have a peer-reviewed academic segments. And then there's the International Journal of Role-Playing and Analog Game Studies, which are open access journals that do publish a lot about LARP. And that is the end of my deck of slides. At this point, if there's questions, I can try to answer them.
can you give us examples of LARPs that have been like researched? And I mean like also with the impact of the LARPs on the participants.
Yes, I can. There's a very well-known, famous paper by Markus Montola, the positive, negative experience in role-playing. I think that was its name. It's been reprinted in one of the Nordic LARP books, the Foundation Stone on Nordic LARP. I think this should probably come with a trigger warning for sexual abuse. He looked into player experiences with the game's gang rape and the journey, which are both extremely heavy games. The like stuff that I find it fascinating to read about. I would never want to play them. But yeah, those are games that have been researched. And there's an entire book about College of Wizardry that's more or less academic.
So I have another question. Let's say that we are a group of LARP designers and runners, and we want to do some games, and we would actually like to, have a better research on after a LARP. What was the impact on the participants? Just as having some of the LARPers made a Google form questionnaire, like how did you enjoy it, what problems you had, and so on. We would like to go a level up with this, but we are not researchers. We do not have the academic methodology, background, and also limited time to do this because we usually do this for fun, not as our job. But still, is there a tool that we can use? Because you spoke about different aspects, how to measure, how to research. Do you know of any tool that we can use to check what the players actually get out of it?
No, I don't think such a thing exists. You need what I would advise you to is to find a sociologist and ask for their help. Because you need to do the questionnaire, and then you need to crunch the numbers. I don't think there is, unfortunately, a shortcut.
Do you think something like that can exist? Or maybe not, because each LARP is different and a different methodology would have to be applied. Or maybe is it possible after all?
Actually, but I have to say that I don't know. I'm, as stated, not that good with researching people.
Any other questions?
Thank you for this overview of approaches. It was really cool. Can you tell what are you now focusing on? What is your now, I don't know, main research project or something? Would be super nice to know.
Yeah, what I'm actually researching right now is not LARP. I'm researching table of role-playing games. I'm at present doing my master's thesis on the vast narratives of the Living Greyhawk D&D campaign, which was this huge thing that ran in the early 2000s. They put out like 2,000 adventure modules for it, and then when it ended, it just vanished, and you can't even pirate those anymore. So I'm documenting that.
Okay, so thanks for these amazing presentations, and bravo. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
We will have half an hour break right now, and then we will have more programs, so come back.